All right. Let's talk about arrows. So I work at a pro shop, and believe it or not, my main job is actually building custom arrows for people. So recently I branched out, I started working on a lot more bows, helping a lot more customers, stuff like that. But my number one priority in the morning whenever I get in is to catch up on arrow builds. So we have a full custom online arrow builder on our website. So that's a lot of what I do, is just fulfilling those orders. And then also we do the same exact thing in stores. We offer it online and in stores. So I spend a lot of time with arrows. And because of that, I've learned a ton. I'm still in the learning phase. There's still a lot to learn and I'll never know it all. But I have learned a ton, and I thought about it, and I wanted to sit down and make a video like this because what I'm about to tell you in this video, I feel like probably 80% of the people I deal with, customers that I deal with, don't even know about it. And it's not some secret knowledge or anything like that. It's pretty well known. It's just that the people in our generation, I say my generation kind of loosely because really anyone from probably 30 to my age and younger don't really know about this, just because it's not something that's talked about and not something that the industry has talked about in recent years. So basically in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down the perfect arrow setup for you that will basically kill anything it hits and explaining to you exactly how to make it. But before we get into that, I want to start out with some things that people worry about with arrows that they absolutely should not. So for example, arrow length. So many people have no idea what to cut their arrows to. They'll be like, oh man, I don't know, I've got a 28-inch draw, what do you think? And basically a good rule of thumb is going to be go carbon to carbon on all your measurements. It's going to make stuff way easier because it doesn't matter how long the knock is or how long your outsert is, nothing like that. If you go carbon to carbon, that measurement will apply to absolutely every arrow across the board. And personally, I like to match that measurement to the person's draw length. So typically the arrow is going to end up right at the edge of the riser if you do this. It's kind of the perfect length, but that's easy to remember. If you can remember your draw length, you can remember your arrow length. If you can remember your arrow length, you can remember your draw length. And there's no more confusion for either. A second thing that people worry about that they really shouldn't is trends. So as of recent, there's been a light arrow trend. Just a couple years ago, there was a very heavy arrow trend. Also, we're still kind of in the high FOC era, if you want to call it that. So there's a lot of trends going on. There always is, not just in the outdoor industry, obviously, but it does apply to arrows. And we'll have people coming in who have shot the same arrow setup for 10 years, have killed countless animals with it, absolutely no problems and a ton of success. And they'll be like, hey, I was thinking about going to a lighter arrow. What do you guys got? And they'll throw us for a whirl because we'll be like, hey, well, hasn't this worked in the past? And they'll say, yeah. We're like, okay, why change it? Now I do get it's a lot of fun to try new stuff. I try new stuff all the time, but at the same time, always remember what has worked in the past, because you won't believe what people will say whenever they see some trend. They'll be like, man, I just don't feel like my setup's right, whenever they've killed countless animals with it and haven't ran into a single problem for years. And the last thing that people need to avoid that they just get so hung up on pretty often is the perfect arrow weight. So people will say, for example, I want a build that's 450 grains. And I'll say, okay, well, I can build your arrow this way and get it to 453. Is that close enough? And they'll be like, no. And I don't run into this too often, but it's being extremely nitpicky to get it down to the exact grain. I understand entirely. I'm pretty picky about my arrow weight, but at the same time, if I'm shooting for 380 and I end up at 385, I'm not going to be upset. 5 grains is not a make or break for me. So getting all that out of the way, now the question is, what is the perfect arrow setup for you? And I mean you personally. I'm going to be breaking down a few different options. So something that people don't know much about is arrow spine. Now that's simply just the stiffness of your arrow. Actually got one right here, but your spine is just going to be your stiffness. So how stiff is your arrow? The higher the poundage, the longer the draw length, you want to go stiffer, and the shorter the poundage, the shorter the draw length, you want to go less stiff. So for example, my brother shoots a 400 spine. He's 15 years old. He's pulling about 40 pounds, and he's got like a 25-inch draw length. Meanwhile, I'm pulling just over 70 pounds. I've got a 29.5-inch draw length, so I'm realistically going to be in like a 300 to 340 spine. 350 is also pretty much the same as 340. And on that same note, spine basically works up. So on the low end, you're going to have your stiffest arrow, and going up from there is going to be your lightest arrow as far as spine goes, not weight. That all depends on the setup and everything like that. Also, one more thing on that, your weight is going to be adjusted with the spine. So for example, this Easton 5.0 340 spine is a 7.5 GPI, which means grain per inch. And then whenever you go up to a 300 spine, I think it jumps up to like an 8.7 or something like that. So a little more weight is added with a stiffer spine. Most people fall into a 350 or 300 spine. Those are the two most common because most people are between about 27 inches and 29.5 inches on the draw length, and between like 60 to 70 pounds. And that range basically applies to just about any arrow. So for me personally, I kind of fall between a 300 and a 350 spine. I really could shoot either and it be entirely safe. Now 300 is realistically probably the more accurate one. I want to go a little bit lighter with this 5.0 build though, so I went with a 340 just to get that lower DPI. I got a perfect bullet hole out of it, haven't had any problems, so I'm running with a 340 spine. So there is definitely right and wrong, but there's also a little bit of room for preference in there as well. So like I said, most people between like a 27 and a 29.5 inch draw length end up in that 350 spine to 300 spine. Say you're 27 inches pulling 80 pounds, I'd say a 300 spine, but say you're only pulling 70, I'd probably say like a 340, 350. Now, if you're my size, you're pulling 80 pounds, I definitely would say a 300, maybe like a 250, but that'd kind of be stretching it, to be honest, on the stiff side. But if you're pulling 70 pounds, I'd say what I said about my setup, and you can kind of go between a 350, 340. I'll leave a link below to a spine chart just so that way you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about. There's definitely categories, there's definitely wrong and right, but there's a little bit of leeway in there for personal preference if you want to go with a slightly heavier build, slightly lighter build, or just a slightly stiffer arrow rather than a less stiff one. So anyways, this number here on the arrow that everyone wonders about, it's not a spline, which I don't know where that came from, but I've heard that word countless times. It's also not the weight of the arrow, it is the arrow spine or stiffness. Just to clear that up, because honestly, not a lot of people know that. I say that, a lot of people know it, but you would be surprised at the number of customers that we get that don't know it. And I'm not trying to insult our customers at all. We got some great ones, but it's just, this knowledge is just not out there like it should be, so that's why I'm making this video. So now moving on to arrow weight, which is so controversial, and this is similar to spine. There's definitely some rights and wrongs, but there's also a lot of room for preference, and honestly a lot more room for preference with arrow weight than it is arrow stiffness. So this arrow build right here, 340 spine in the Easton 5.0, I've got a 3-fletch X-Fan with a 4-inch orange wrap. We're running a 25 grain aluminum half out with a 100 grain tip, and this full build is only 385 grains. Super lightweight, and I wouldn't be super comfortable shooting it at an animal, except for the fact that it's producing 86 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is honestly the most important. It's kind of the key ingredient to the right arrow build. And this is really what I'm talking about whenever I say 80% of our customers don't even know what I'm gonna tell you in this video. It's exactly that. Kinetic energy is basically everything you need for the perfect arrow setup. Now, some of you may have heard that and just clicked off the video. Some of you may have heard that and decided to stay longer because you don't even know what that means. So real quick, I'm going to explain it. Kinetic energy is basically the amount of energy that is hitting the target or animal whenever your arrow makes impact, and it's measured in foot-pounds. So like I said, this arrow setup is producing 86 foot-pounds of kinetic energy with my setup, which is just ridiculous. People worry so much about FOC and right arrow weight and all this stuff that doesn't matter as much as kinetic energy. Now, I'm not saying that stuff doesn't matter, but it does not matter on a scale of what is most important in an arrow setup, especially to kill an animal. It does not matter as much as how much energy this arrow is actually producing. Because you can say all day long that your arrow setup that's 630 grains with 27% FOC is the perfect setup and all this, and that is the only setup that can kill a deer or a moose or an elk or whatever it is that you're hunting. But in reality, you're gonna have a super long sight tape. You're not gonna have clearance for much yardage, and your arrow at 20 yards is probably gonna look like this. So that's just not an ideal setup. Now, it does work. Like I said, there's a lot of room for personal preference. If that is your exact setup and you're shooting it and you're doing well with it, that's completely fine. But what I'm saying is there's a better way around it than doing something like that. So even an arrow so light as 385 grains can fly through an animal with absolutely no problem, as long as you have the right setup and the right amount of energy on impact. So for example, like I said, I'm 29.5 inch draw, pulling 70 pounds. And by the way, you can just go to Easton's website and pull up their kinetic energy calculator. You can simply punch in all your information. So we'll say 385 on the weight. I'm shooting 315 feet per second on my lift X, and there you have it. Okay, I was off by 2. 84.85 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, and all you need to kill big game is 40 foot-pounds. So that's double what you need to kill a moose, to kill an elk, to kill a bear. That's a ridiculous setup, and it's only 385 grains. I'm not advocating for a super light arrow. I personally prefer for a hunting arrow to be in the mid 400s, say 425 to 450. And again, that's kind of personal preference. I just think that's kind of the perfect recipe for a whitetail. But at the same time, a lot of what people are doing nowadays is extremely unnecessary, and you'll hear a lot of old timers talking about kinetic energy, and it's for a good reason, because they actually grew up with a knowledge of what works, not just a knowledge of what sells. We're in this age of the archery industry where it has become just that, an industry. It's a huge industry, which is awesome for people like me. I get to make money off of what I love. I get to work on bows, build custom arrows, make videos talking about it, and make money. But at the same time, we've lost a lot of knowledge, and there's a lot of more focused on what can sell and also getting people to buy more times than once. So you can make something popular like super high FOC. Someone goes out, buys an arrow setup with super high FOC, and then they realize they don't need all that, so they end up buying another setup that's a lot lighter with less FOC. So all that being said, I would highly recommend doing some research before you get your arrows built, or if you build them yourself, whatever it is, just look into it, see what you're producing energy-wise if you're wanting to hunt. Like I said, you only need 40 foot-pounds of kinetic energy to take down a moose. And a lot of it is shot placement. I'll say that too. People will shoot into the shoulder of an elk and they'll come back complaining like, hey, what in the world, you know, my arrow should have gone through that, whenever in reality, it shouldn't have. You needed to hit right behind the shoulder, not in the shoulder. You can't expect to punch through that whenever a rifle bullet won't. So most important thing in an arrow, as far as hunting goes, is your kinetic energy. That is by far the most important thing, in my personal opinion, to a successful arrow, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make an arrow that we don't have to worry about. We can just rely on to be successful at killing things. Like I said, for whitetail, I really like that mid 400s range. Now, it's not for everyone. If you're like a 32-inch draw length shooting 80 pounds, you could definitely go a lot heavier and be just as effective, if not more effective. But it's kind of crazy the setups people have because they just don't have a knowledge of what the right setup is. I'm not saying I know everything, but I'm saying that it's fairly simple, and I want to get this info out there because you can have a setup like this, 385 grains, and realistically, I could kill an elk with it. Now, that being said, components is a whole nother talk. This is an aluminum half out. I would personally like to run like a stainless steel or something on the front to be a little bit more robust, but you get where I'm coming from. It's all about energy and just having the right setup to you. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video of me talking about arrows for, I guess, 18 minutes now. Wow, I'll have to cut some of that out, kind of rambled, but I just want to get this info out there, help you guys out, hopefully make life a little bit easier for you, and get out and shoot. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll have some more videos on the way. See you in the next one.